Have you heard of the West Bank?
The West Bank, which is home to over 3 million Palestinians, the eastern half of Jerusalem, as well as some of the holiest sites for Christians, Jews, and Muslims.
Sitting, as it does, on the western side of the Jordan River. Nearly 3 million people live here, about 2.5 million Palestinians, and more than 400,000 Jewish settlers.
Today I'm going to talk with Ewa Górska. She is an academic of law and ethics. Also, she is specialized in Middle Eastern studies. She spent some time in West Bank, Lebanon, and other parts of Middle East researching there. Today we are going to talk about West Bank, but not only the political side, the human side of it. I feel like there is not much conversation about that, so I'm very curious on how the day-to-day life look like there, what's going on in people's mind, and what is the economical life there. So we will try to keep the political side short and try to focus on this side more. This is the Mallu Experience podcast. To support it, please hit the subscribe button. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Ewa Górska. So hello again, Ewa.
Hi again. Thanks
Hi.
for having me.
Thanks for coming. You are an academic of law, ethics, and specialized in Middle East too. So what took you to Middle East? What was interesting?
Oh my, that's a long story. Yeah, I was in High School of Fine Arts,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I was supposed to study fine arts. It's just I was never sure about it. And in my final class of high school, we went to Israel, which right now for me is a bit confusing or complicated, I guess. But then I really didn't know much about the situation in the region, only bits from the news. So we went there for like a week, but it was somehow enough to get me hooked.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came back, I got interested in Islamic art. And slowly from there, I didn't really know what I want to study. Should it be art? Should it be law? I wasn't really sure about that either. So I ended up going to Middle Eastern studies, cultural studies. And a year after, I also decided to study law,
Mm-hmm.
to combine it somehow. But law was actually my second degree. I wasn't really into it. So yeah, long story short, somehow I ended up finishing MA in Middle Eastern Studies, but sticking to law, doing PhD in law, and also like I'm specialized in Sociology of Law. So actually, research about law is used in life,
Mm-hmm.
how it is adjusted, how is it part of society and culture. And I'm not really practicing lawyer, and I'm also not really interested in theory so much.
Okay. So did both of your categories go hand in hand, law and the study in Middle East?
Yeah, I made it happen somehow. At least for me, it works. It also changes over the years. So my PhD was about bioethics and Islamic law in some Arab countries, 3 Arab countries. But then I switched a bit. So now my research is focused a bit more on Islamophobia in law in Europe, in
Oh, yeah,
Poland,
okay.
in courts in Poland, and in Europe. Because now I also realize that what drives me is being angry at stereotypes and discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I find that there's a widespread belief that I think is very simplified and untrue and possibly discriminatory, I'm going in to kind of try to see what's behind it and how much it affects, for example, law, how much it affects courts. So I changed the scenery a bit.
But do you think you see that a lot? Islamophobia being instated in the law?
Well, in Poland, I would say it's not so obvious because, first of all, still Muslim communities, because there are many different groups, are still pretty small. and possibly don't have so much, like contact with the law. However, of course, as everywhere else, there are attacks, for example, hate crimes also committed against Muslims, but also, other groups. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's not even about who the person attacked is, but who the attackers at this moment hate. Plus, from research that I did with my friend on hate crime cases in Poland, a lot of these cases are just influenced by alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, sometimes it's just about bias, and it's not really about who is being attacked or why.
Okay, so it's not about certain religion, certain background. It's
Yeah, well, of course, there are moments when certain backgrounds and certain groups are attacked more. And I think in recent years, generally in Europe, like in the US after 9/11, these were Muslims, like Muslims were vilified.
mm-hmm.
And Arabs as well, because for many people, this, like, I don't even think many people know really what's the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know best. But definitely these groups were vilified, and also vilified in pop culture, in the media. So it's not surprising that people would be scared and have this bias, because this is what they learn. This
Yeah.
is how people are socialized. But also in recent years, when we did research up until more or less the Ukrainian war, the attack of Russia on Ukraine. And Ukrainians were very often attacked in Poland as well.
Oh yeah, I'm aware. I have read many places, but I think media has to play a big part in it, like the news channels. I wouldn't say. I mean, right now social media too, X also, Twitter formerly. But yeah, I think in general, media has a lot to do. At least in my experience, I have noticed during the last election period in Poland, like I was reading in expat groups, there is more attacks. There is, also like you said, it's mostly by drunk people. But still, I think they watch this from home. They watch in TV that immigrants are coming, they're taking our jobs, so on and so on, and they're getting drunk. They're seeing someone on the street, and I think that's the birth of hate crime there.
Exactly. And that sums up half of my research. The other half is internet, I would say. So there's still a lot of hate crimes committed in the comments.
Cyberbullying,
cyber stalking even, and then a lot of aggression. And sometimes it's directed at a specific person, and sometimes it's just directed at a group. And people really believe they're anonymous in the internet and that everything will go. And it's not only, like, we did research mostly about Facebook hate crimes.
mm-hmm.
Mostly, I guess, because no one really looked at X, or formerly Twitter, to file complaints with the prosecution that hate crimes are committed there. But people are not aware that they can be tracked. They're not aware that what they're saying or writing is actually a hate crime. And that it can lead to consequences, which not only legal consequences against them, but also that they're actually adding up to all this bias and hatred.
Hello, we have to take a short break, and I have to tell you to subscribe to the channel. That's the only way as a channel we can grow. The more numbers means I can show that to potential guests, and it will help me in bringing more interesting conversations to you. And if you like the content, only if you like the content, press the like button and share it with your friends. Now, let's get back to the show.
Blow up.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you take someone to court on a comment?
Yeah, you can.
Can you maybe give me some example of a hate crime, cyber hate crime?
Yeah, so a comment that all refugees should drown, or all Muslims should drown, or that it's good that, for example, there's war on Palestinians, and the more you kill, the more terrorists you kill. Such comments, of course, it always depends a bit on wording, because we're still talking law. So, it depends how it's interpreted and how it's written. But you can actually get punished for writing that.
Oh, interesting. I think very less people know about that.
No, and also people don't know, because the thing is that there's so much hate on the internet. No one really looks at it as something that they can do something about it, right? So, and also the system is a bit annoying. But if you see a comment like that on the internet, like every one of us can go send a letter to prosecutor's office or go to the police and say that there's a hate crime happening there, most probably. Because this is one of those instances in which the prosecution will act only based on forgot the legal word for it, will act based only on a complaint from a person that possibly a crime is being committed. So you need to go and notify them. And then it's a bit annoying that, someone has to take responsibility to take the person committing a hate crime online in a comment to notify the services that it's being...
the process.
And then there's the whole process.
Bureaucracy.
And the bureaucracy. And also there's so many comments like that.
Yeah.
But it does happen, and it actually is pretty smooth, especially with the most hateful comments in which people are wishing someone dead, a group or a person, because of who they are. But here we have another issue with Polish law that for now in the criminal code, there are certain groups that can be attacked based on their... not can be attacked. Okay, I will say it again. So there are certain groups which, if they're attacked based on their characteristics, based on what group they possibly are in or representing, then it's a hate crime. But if you're not one of those groups, it's not a hate crime. So I'm going to give you an example.
Okay.
If you're attacked because you're an Arab, it will be a hate crime because you're attacked because of your ethnicity. If you're attacked based on your nationality as well, on your faith, lack of faith, in some of the instances, your political views, but in general, but if you're attacked, for example, because of your gender, your sexual orientation, because you're disabled, then it's not a hate crime.
Ah, okay. So even sexual orientation?
No, not in Polish law. So, and we have actually a problem with European Union because of that for many years, but no one really does anything about it. So it's a bit, you can have a hater who actually hates many groups at the same time. And we also see that in our research, that people actually don't have a problem with attacking someone because he or she is Jewish, Arab, homosexual, whatever. It's not like this person is all that things, but people just use all kind of slurs at the same time.
Yeah.
Even contradictory ones, just because it's more about emotions of the person
It's
doing
just
the
coming
attack.
out. Especially on the internet, it's easy because you are behind a mask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you think that you're behind a mask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So coming back to Middle East, you told me, when did you first travel to Jerusalem?
To Jerusalem 2009,
Okay,
10?
long time ago.
8? Long time ago. Yeah, let's stick to long time ago.
Okay. So, and after that, you have been there back and forth a few times. So, I would like to know how the life goes on in West Bank, because we hear in news about all the politics. There's multiple conversations about Gaza, West Bank, or any other parts of this territory. But I am very curious how a day-to-day life goes on there and how difficult it is. And if we have some misconceptions, maybe it's not as strict as it's shown on the media, or it's more extreme than shown on the media. So take me through a day in West Bank.
Yeah, this is tricky because both of the ends of the spectrum that you just mentioned are happening at the same time. So it's more strict and life is more normal than we think at the same time. So yeah, one day in the West Bank would be that you basically get up in the morning and find a nearest coffee shop if you want to eat out and drink coffee and eat outside. And well, my life would be that I would go with my laptop there and eat breakfast, have coffee, and then a second coffee, and then work a bit. And then people would come, and then friends would come. And you spend your day with friends. And of course, if you live with a family, you spend your day with family. And it's most of the time, and of course, I haven't been there in the past year and a half, but most of the time, life is very normal. Like, people are very focused on their families and their work and their problems with their work, and the boss is an asshole. Can I swear on your podcast?
Of course, feel free.
Thank you. So, you know, like the regular stuff. And as long as you're staying in your bubble within one city, you possibly don't see the occupation, especially if you're in a city. So you can stay inside, and you go, you buy your falafel sandwich, you buy your dinner, or you buy groceries in a normal supermarket. You go home, you cook, you pet your neighbor's dog or cat, or your own cat. And, drink coffee, watching the sunset, because sunsets in Palestine are ridiculously beautiful. It's ridiculous because it's mountainous area. And it's just amazing. So, you go to your balcony and you just watch the sunset. And somewhere in between during that day you work. But what I always found lovely is that people take more time to actually sit down with other people, and it's very normal to drop by at your friend's workplace to have a coffee or tea during a day. No one is annoyed. And then in the afternoon, like if you're in a larger city that was traditionally Christian, like Bethlehem or Ramallah, you go out for a drink to a bar, you go and drink beer or something else, and you meet your friends. In certain places, like what I do is rock climbing. So there are 2 climbing gyms in Ramallah, and you can go rock climbing with friends, and then you go a bit outside of the city. The nature is also beautiful. Like you can see wild animals, but you can see also all those terraces with old olive trees. Some of those olive trees are like 2,000 or 3,000 years old.
Oh,
and you
wow.
just pass them to go to rocks and to just climb. And then you have to watch out for all those birds that are sometimes nesting in the cliffs. And then we don't really want to, make their life more trouble for them, so we don't climb around there. And it's very much, normal and focused on life. And there's so much music and culture and artists. Like, things are happening all the time, especially in the cities. The culture is thriving. Of course, there's more of movements for various rights, also eco, for marginalized groups, feminists, like things are happening, and you can see there's life brewing all the time. But then, you, for example, go outside of that city because you want to go climbing, and you have to pass a checkpoint.
Okay.
And then lots of the time you just pass it. And of course, I'm white privileged European. I have my European passport. And, my hair is not dark enough to it's still visible. I might be a foreigner and outsider, so I'm very privileged in all those checkpoints. But you can also see a lot of harassment towards Palestinians from Israeli soldiers. And then if something is happening, if there's unrest in another city, or there was unrest somewhere else in the West Bank, which is, by the way, very small, like for comparison with like Polish regions, there's this one of the smallest voivodeships in Poland, Świętokrzyskie, and West Bank is half of it.
Yeah, like I wanted to ask you that to give the listeners, because even I am very bad with maps. I see West Bank on map, I see Gaza on map, but I can't put a realistic view how big it is. So from one end to the, let's say the other part of border, how long it would take you to drive?
Well, that's a tricky question because I have to drive. Which roads am I driving?
I don't know.
Should I drive like it's apartheid, which we didn't even get to yet. But if I'm driving on Jewish only roads, it's probably faster. If I'm driving on Palestinian only roads, ages, because also there will be checkpoints on the way. I'm not sure. It's probably very complicated. I'm not sure if it's possible to drive from one end to another without passing a checkpoint. I don't think so. And then if I'm a foreigner, I'm privileged. Most probably, for example, I would rent a car that has yellow plates, Israeli plates, which means I can drive on both types of roads.
Okay.
But I'm also checked on the checkpoints to see if I'm not Israeli. It's another long story why. But the segregation is very real. And I think in Polish, if we would try to translate it into Polish reality, it maybe should take me 2-3 hours to drive from north to south of the West Bank just because it's mountains and there are no highways.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if I could do it in one day. Maybe if I'm lucky, if it's a very calm situation and not many checkpoints.
In the
maybe.
best case scenario.
Best case scenario, I did that years ago, driving, and it took us just a few hours from the north to the center of the West Bank. But it depends, and it changes so fast. Like you have permanent checkpoints and you have flying checkpoints, and those can happen anywhere. And Israeli army can block roads from 1 minute to another. And now, of course, since the attack on Gaza happened, on 7th of October and after 7th of October of 2023, it's worse. It's much worse when it comes to freedom of movement of Palestinians in the West Bank. But before that, it was, it would depend on the time period and if something is happening or if the Israeli army just wants to, push people a bit more, pressure them a bit more closer to their breaking point.
Okay. So when you say about apartheid and these different roads, how does it look like? There is two different mode of transport ways that...
Yes, exactly. You have roads that are shared, and they are shared mostly because it's easier for the Israelis if those highways are shared. But then there are roads to Israeli settlements, which are illegal under the international law, but happen to be everywhere, basically. And military bases and Israeli various plants, for example, around the settlements that they're, for example, producing something. Or they taking over the land because they're saying it's either they have some religious reasons and they want that part of the land, or they want grazing space because they decide this should be their grazing space, or they just take over the land because they want to. And then there are certain roads that lead to Israeli, for example, settlements that Palestinians cannot go on. It's forbidden for them to enter those. So there's like a double system of roads. And then also technically Israelis are forbidden to enter certain areas that are under Palestinian rule. And then it is systematic in this way that the whole region of West Bank is divided into 3 areas, A, B, and C.
Yep.
This comes from Oslo agreements, which were supposed to be this amazing, peaceful solution of all the problems of the world.
Yeah.
And actually did more harm than good and screwed Palestinians even more. And the whole system of ABC was supposed to be technically areas from which Israelis would pull out. And first they would pull out from Palestinian cities, of course, most, like Palestinian populated areas. And these were areas A, and they were supposed to be under Palestinian rule. And then the areas B, mostly
Also
towns.
security under Palestinians.
Yes. So also internal security, and technically, like the whole area is under security of Palestinians and Palestinian Authority, which later became Palestinian state on paper, because not in reality. And then areas B were towns, and then Palestinian Authority had policing inside those towns. This was like this kind of internal security was on them, but outside security on the Israeli army.
Mm-hmm.
And then area C, technically less inhabited areas, but practically possibly more important because a lot of resources are there.
Okay.
So these are green lands, farming lands, but also underneath there's lots of water, which is very strategic to Israel. That's why Israel is also one of the many reasons Israel is trying to take over and have control of their West Bank, because there's water there. And area C is 61%. So most of the West Bank is area C.
And it's under fully Israel control.
And it was supposed to be technically an area from which the Israelis would pull out in the end. Like these agreements were from 90s, 93, then 95 second also agreements. It was supposed to take 5 years. Like even if you lean on and give them some space, like around 2000s, they were supposed to move out completely. They never did. Right now, area C, so over 60% of the West Bank is under full direct Israeli control, military control, which means it's military law, not civilian law, which from my perspective is important, and I guess people underneath living under it as well. And it means that especially there you have all the settlements, and the settlements are not like, a small town of few buildings. These are also cities of few thousand or sometimes even dozens of thousands of people, with all the resources of like a small city, and a separate communication, so separate roads and separate bus system.
Yeah. Public transport is also divided?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and now even in East Jerusalem, it's a bit more divided than it used to be. Like, for example, Israeli taxi will not take you inside East Jerusalem to a Palestinian neighborhood. You have to have a Palestinian taxi. And we are speaking about Jerusalem, like I'm talking about Jerusalem right now, which was annexed by Israel into Israel. So it's technically in the Israeli national borders, and it's already apartheid and divided internally. And West Bank is like it's complete division and separation of people. They are not supposed to meet. And this is also the thing about separated road systems, that on the entrance to Palestinian villages and towns and cities, you get those red boards that say that entrance for Israeli citizens is illegal and they can be fined and also moved out from there forcibly by their army. And it's actually based on military order. So it's a military order for Israeli civilians that they cannot enter Palestinian areas or they will be fined.
But it's put up by PLO?
No, it's put up by Israelis.
Okay.
And it usually says entering is dangerous to your life.
Okay.
But the thing is, like, if you look at it systematically, it's just one of the instances of how, especially Israelis, are trying to divide two societies. So there's more fear and distrust. And another instance is, for example, the separation wall, the famous separation wall that runs around the West Bank and is still not completed. And, like because of that, Israelis and Palestinians cannot really meet. Like apart from Palestinians who have permits to work in Israel, people don't meet each other anymore. Like Palestinians, the Israelis that Palestinians know are the ones on checkpoints. And it's still a tiny bit better because Palestinians from West Bank still are more often allowed a permit to go, for example, to Jerusalem or maybe work in Israel and, to actually see that the people on the other side are people. But with Gaza, it's totally different. Like Gaza was under blockade, which is a form of occupation also for so long, since 2006, basically, it was totally blocked, apart from like very serious medical reasons on which you could travel, or sometimes if you have a permit, you can travel abroad. But the Israelis you see are those who are invading from time to time. Every few years, there was an invasion on Gaza. And, the last generation, people who now are 18, most of them never met an Israeli who wasn't in an army uniform. Like, it's a bit crazy because it's a tiny place and you live next to each other. Gaza is like half of Krakow, maybe. So it's small, and it's like you don't meet someone who lives at the other end of the city because there's a wall in between. There are minefields, snipers, checkpoints. And the person there speaks with, like, they have a different language, different culture. They say they're different than you and that you're dangerous to them and that they're dangerous to you. Like, if you create this tension also.
It's in the psyche and it goes on for generations. I mean, that's what's happening.
And you have traumas also from generation to generation and on both sides.
Yeah.
So it's a very tough mix, I would say.
So in the West Bank, there are not lots of Israelis other than the settlers?
Yeah, well, 500,000 of settlers and then the army. You don't... How do I phrase it? The only Israelis that you can meet in the West Bank right now, apart from the soldiers and the settlers, is a handful of activists who are not worried and know how to get in, avoiding being stopped at the checkpoints.
Okay.
But because there's less and less of them, like 20 years ago, before the blockade of Gaza and before the wall around the West Bank, activists from both sides would to go somewhere and, drink beer or tea. Like, I know activists from Israel who would go to Gaza to have tea with their friends, and others who would come to Bethlehem to have beer with Palestinian activists. And then you have this... Basically, it's a peace process that comes and reconciliation process that comes from bottom up.
It's like the human side.
Yeah. And from like people connecting and being less afraid of each other. But if you have a militarized country, ethnocracy, basically, ethno-state based on ethnic rules and assuming that one ethnicity is better than the other. And if you have, a system of one nation that is basically trying to erase the other because they're colonizing the land.
Yeah.
Then, having the whole bottom-up reconciliation, peaceful relation building, and humanization of the other side doesn't really fit. And this is for me.
I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah.
Not to humanize with each other.
Well, I don't think, honestly, Israeli soldiers could do what they're doing in Gaza if they could see humans on the other side of their rifles and drones. Not even mentioning the gamification right now, because young soldiers are basically playing games. Not really fully, I think, emotionally connecting with how real it is, but there's so much dehumanization that it's the only, actually, I think, way to make it possible. And of course, that also means there's radicalization on both sides. And then that has to
I mean, that will be the cycle. Like,
That's
you cannot
yeah.
have one radical side. There will be resistance, and from that resistance, it will be radicalized. There will be people who want to take advantage of it too. So coming back to the day-to-day life in West Bank, how much percentage of people work in Israel, and or if they work in West Bank, what kind of work are available there?
So I don't know what's the percentage right now, also because of everything that was and is happening, definitely less. Another thing is that a lot of Palestinians work in Israel illegally, which is also a funny thing in a way, because the whole idea of the wall was to be, from Israeli perspective, a security barrier, basically to stop Palestinians to coming illegally on the other side, because Palestinians, according to the Israeli narrative, were a security threat as possible terrorists. However, the wall never stopped anyone. There are famous photos of people just putting, like a ladder and just going from one side to another, because Israeli economy, especially when it comes to labor, builders especially, is based or was based largely on cheap labor from the West Bank and sometimes from Gaza as well. So a lot of people worked in Israel. Some had permits, some were doing it illegally. And that was also a bit, I guess, a normal way of life. Of course, there were two sides. Like, first of all, the salaries in Israel were a bit better. But on the other hand, mostly these people were worked as unskilled labor, so also not the best salaries, not mentioning those who are working illegally. But yeah, a lot of people still work in the West Bank. Services, I think, is one of the largest parts of the whole economy there. So my friends would work in startups, IT. One was accountant in a circus, which probably is not a very regular thing. Also, I was in a bubble that was a bit more artsy, so private businesses, musicians, bar owners. Again, I would say regular thing, like working at the university.
Yeah.
Same as here.
Okay. I mean, it sounds normal, like you said, it sounds like here, but then there is this whole other dystopia about being inside the wall. It's very hard to comprehend what you explain. Okay, there is a normal life. You go to bar, you go to cafe, you meet with friends, and then at the same time, you are literally in an open air prison.
Yes. Which is like, it's doing things to your mind, believe me. Like, that was at some point, that was my problem as well. Another was that I was privileged to leave.
Yeah.
But I got this mental blockade, like this prison mentality, I was always afraid that if I leave, I might not be able to enter, but also like felt that it was so confusing that I am able to leave, but my friends aren't. And also, like, it's fascinating how people can adapt to every possible conditions, and that the whole violence and pressure is just there, but it affects people. It affects children. It affects women. It affects men. It's just always there, and on one hand, everyone is having a life and just adjusting, and it's becoming, your everyday normal. But on the other, there's always this fear, mostly because the situation is changing also rapidly. Which is, when I mentioned earlier flying checkpoints, it's part of that. It's also part of the systematic oppression that
What is a flying checkpoint?
It's a checkpoint that is just like the soldiers are coming and putting it there. Because checkpoints are like, you have different categories. there are some that are permanent. So always, if you're on that road, in that place, there's this whole. It looks a bit like when you cross borders. Even in Europe, between European countries.
Yeah.
Mostly they're unmanned now, but you can see this kind of, you
Yeah.
have to slow down, you go through, they have those like roofs and
Yes.
boxes.
Let's say like toll stations.
Like toll stations, exactly, perfect. So those would be permanent checkpoints. And then they stop, not everyone, but they can stop often people there.
Okay, so when they stop a Palestinian, let's talk about in a majority case, not about exceptions. What do they do? Like, can I show just a card and they let me go? Or they want to check me personally or my vehicle?
So in most of the cases, they would just, in those checkpoints inside the West Bank, because let's also make clear distinctions, they will check your ID as a Palestinian. Possibly just look, if you have it, just look at it and then they let you go. Sometimes they don't check Palestinian cars. If it's calm, they just let people pass. It's a bit different if you're having a car with yellow plates. That means it's Israeli plates. So either you have Palestinians inside who have a permit to go to Israel and have that car, or maybe are from the so-called Palestine 48, meaning Israel. That's another story. Or you might have foreigners who rented a car with Israeli plates, and then they also want to ask you questions because these permanent checkpoints are mostly on roads that are for Palestinians only, so they also don't want Israelis traveling on those. So they check you a bit more thoroughly. Also, if, they're in a bad mood, they can pressure people more but mostly asking questions. And usually not much happens unless they're in a bad mood, they're searching for someone, they're searching for something, or they want to, make this kind of, how do you call it if like one person commits a crime but the whole family bears responsibility? There's a specific word in English.
I can't remember.
I can Google it later.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. People can also figure it out. No, it's like, I'm still looking for that word. Anyways, like the collective responsibility.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you and sorry for that whole
No
minute
problem.
of thinking. So if something happens somewhere, they might want to make all Palestinians pay the price.
We'll take it out on them.
Take it out on them. Also, make them late for work. Like I remember situations in which the road between Bethlehem and Ramallah that would take hour and a half would take 6 hours.
Wow.
Because of permanent checkpoints that would check everyone. Plus, for example, flying checkpoints, so those that are not there permanently, but the armored vehicle with Israeli soldiers comes and just set up a checkpoint.
And what's the difference between, because I read somewhere there is a blue card and red card?
Green card.
What's the
guess.
difference between these?
So I think what you mean, which we could maybe check. Yeah, so that's mostly, again, the system of marking basically the categories of the occupied people. So inhabitants of the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip have green IDs, which means they live in the territories under Palestinian rule, basically. Although that also covers, for example, Area C, which, as we know already, is in practice under Israeli rule. So it's not really about logics, it's more about separation of the people. And then blue IDs are those carried by Jerusalemites, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, because there's there are different categories of people, basically, of Palestinians in this whole region, which let's call it now Palestine 48 or Mandate Palestine, so before Israel was created. So then you had basically one region of Gaza, of what is now Israel, and of West Bank. That was one area under Ottoman rule and then British rule. And then it was divided because Israel was born, started the settlements, founded. The entity was created on Palestinian lands. Because that part of land was colonized by Europeans. And it got divided. And then, of course, the borders were also changing during conflict. But Israel, what they do, how they manage the colonization of the people is also by dividing them by categories, like legal categories. So you have Palestinians who managed in 48 to stay in what is now Israel. And they were granted citizenship, most of them.
Okay.
They are called by Israel, they are called Israeli Arabs because Israel doesn't use officially word Palestinians because this is part of the whole system of erasure of Palestinian identity. Or trying to actually pretending that it doesn't exist. So you have the citizens of Israel that are of Palestinian descent are actually Palestinians. And they are basically second category citizens. There's a lot of restrictions on what can be said, what can be done within the borders of what is called Israel. And then you have Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was at the end of the 48 war when Israel was created and it was still fighting the Arab neighbors, was a divided city. Like the so-called Green Line, the Armistice Line, went through the city next to the old city. And then East Jerusalem was under Jordanian rule until the War of 67, when Israel also started occupying West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights from Syria. And that division stayed in practice. But the thing is that according to international law, the whole occupation that is going on for so long is illegal. And according to international law, East Jerusalem, so for example, the old city of Jerusalem, is occupied. The thing is that Israel annexed it de facto by force in 67, de jure by law in 1980, but it basically connected it to Israel. So now if you go to Jerusalem, you don't really know that from, for example, you're crossing in the old city, you're crossing from the land that technically would belong to Israel, you're crossing to a land that is completely occupied against international law. And you don't see that. You see maybe that there's more Arabic on the street. You might see also, for example, that the streets aren't so clean, which is also a bit of a mental warfare because they're not clean because Israel or Jerusalem municipality is just not paying for cleaning them, even though the Palestinian people living there are paying the same or higher taxes than Israelis. But coming back to the IDs, Jerusalemite Palestinians never got citizenship.
Okay.
Which is mostly about demographics and voting. Israel, from the beginning, did want to take over Jerusalem and did want to make it a Jewish majority city, which means that they, well, first of all, majority as a majority, but second of all, majority as political majority when it comes to voting in local elections. And also then when it comes to voting in national elections. Palestinians residing in Jerusalem never got the citizenship of Israel.
Okay.
Which means they also don't have passports, they have laissez-passer.
They don't even have a Palestinian identity card, something like that?
No, they have Jerusalemite ID because they are still living under Jerusalem rule, and they cannot really technically live under Palestinian Authority. It's just the thing is, it's just this whole mess of bureaucracy, administration, laws that are restrictive. And dispossession, like the whole system is built in the way to dispossess Palestinians of their land and what
By
they
time.
have. Yeah, because for example, if you have a Jerusalemite ID, there's this law. Basically, under legal order of Israel, you're treated like a foreigner. Like if I move to Jerusalem and stay there and have permanent residency, it's basically the same status as people who live there for generations.
People who are born there.
People who are born there and their parents, parents, great-grandparents were born there for, like hundreds of years. And they pay this price because in 1948, they didn't run away.
Yeah.
And they managed to stay, and some of the people who managed to stay in 48 during the Nakba, the so-called catastrophe, when more than 700,000 of Palestinians were
displaced,
were forced to run or to move out. Some of them moved to Jerusalem and stayed there, but mostly they moved either to West Bank or Gaza, or outside of the borders of what was traditionally Palestine. So those people, living there for hundreds of years are treated like foreigners with permanent residency, and they have to prove that their center of life is still in Jerusalem, so they can keep their privilege of living there. So if you go abroad for studies or work for a few years, or if you move to the West Bank because it's way cheaper, and you want to, live in a also sometimes a bit less tense atmosphere than Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, then you can lose the Jerusalem ID, and then you can lose the permit to enter even Jerusalem and Israel, and you're forcibly displaced again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this system is there, and people are actually living in sometimes very small houses or renting a few rooms because they cling to having that privilege of being able to cross borders and go to West Bank but still live in Jerusalem. At the same time, I would say the stress and the insecurity of that is even higher because, people in the West Bank are losing their possessions, their houses and their fields and their farms every day, all the time. But still, it affects a bit more the rural areas of Area C. So it's the settlers in the West Bank are targeting Bedouins a bit more, who are usually living in smaller communities in rural areas, doing shepherding, farm work. While in Jerusalem, there are also settlers who by force are taking over houses, tenement buildings, flats. Sometimes it's, like a whole building with different floors, and the settlers are just taking one apartment because they can.
Yeah.
But it spreads always.
I wanted to ask you about it. There is a famous video. You might have seen it too. One woman arguing with Jewish...
Jonathan.
Jonathan? I don't remember. Jonathan, it's my
John
house.
Or Jonathan.
Yeah, John. Let's call him John. John, it's my house. Why are you standing here? And what he says is, if I don't take it, someone else will take it. So is this a recurring thing there?
Yes.
Is it normal?
Yes.
So someone can come to my house and say they want my house, I have to go out?
Yes.
Wow. And where can I go? Like, is there a police? For sure, not IDF.
Well, if you're in Jerusalem, you would be under Israeli police, technically, but they will be there protecting the settlers stealing your house. So you won't go to them. You will go to courts, possibly. And there are cases in Israeli courts that go on usually for 20 years. And there's a few cases in which the families won. It's all about legal rights in the end somehow, which is also funny because stealing someone's home is
irony.
technically illegal. There's a lot of irony there. But in most of the times, the Israelis claim that that property was Jewish before the 1948 war, so before Israel was created. And because of that, they claim that, according to Israeli law, which was enacted later, they have a right to claim it back. Of course, Palestinians don't have that right. If they lost property during the 1948 catastrophe, they don't have a right to take it back legally on any grounds. But Jewish Israelis tend to claim, especially settlers who are a bit more radical when it comes to that, they tend to claim that there are some grounds to take over that property. And sometimes they falsify documents. Sometimes they have some legal claims, for example, from 19th century. But it's very, there are some documents. Some of them are forged. Some of them are not forged. Then you have to go to Israeli court system to fight for it. There are a few Palestinian families who managed to win those court cases because they were lucky and had very good paperwork from the Ottoman Empire. And that paperwork was saved during the generations and was actually claiming property rights. But most of the people, it was Ottoman Empire, it wasn't documented so well, or it didn't survive all the wars. So it's very hard to win that legal battle, not also mentioning the whole issue of fighting your colonizer and the court of that colonizer, claiming your rights based on the laws introduced by your colonizer after they already colonized you, which is also crazy. And also not everyone wants to do that. But
It's
people try to.
traumatizing.
It's traumatizing. People still try to fight it as long as they can. But it's also expensive, and it really takes a lot of money to basically survive and not be displaced, and to fight all those court levels and, block those settlers who are trying to enter your house by force, because they usually try to use the fait accompli tactics, which usually works. So if they take over, even if the court says after 10 or 20 years that they were wrong and the Palestinian owners were right, evicting settlers is almost impossible.
Okay, when they have the whole, power behind them.
Yeah.
The support.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like in East Jerusalem, for example, in those Palestinian neighborhoods that were traditionally Palestinian neighborhoods, there are Israeli settlements within apartments or buildings. And, you have those very narrow streets on hills with Palestinian housing everywhere. And then, for example, one building on that street is Israeli settlement right now because they took over. Like, imagine living in a city like Krakow or any other city on a very crowded street. You have house next to a house, very small driving space in between, lots of cars parking. Like, it's very hard to drive there. It's on hills, so there's not much place to grow. And then in this neighborhood, which is already very packed, they take over one building with 5 floors, for example. And they put private armed guards downstairs, and in the building they put flags everywhere. They might put metal nets in windows because they're afraid. But people who move there usually move there with families. So then it's pretty, I don't want to say normal because I don't think on any level this is normal, but it's normalized or it's regular occurrence that you go to that street and you see, a Jewish man or Jewish woman pushing a stroller with a small infant in it or having another kid by their hand and walking somewhere with 2 armed guards with guns on them because they want to have a walk on the street, in a neighborhood that they claim is very dangerous to them. But at the same time, they
choosing to move in.
They choose to move in, and they also feel free to walk in that neighborhood. They don't, they're not afraid that someone will attack all of them. They are not really afraid because the consequences of anyone attacking them, the collective responsibility would be so big. We see that in Gaza. We see what collective responsibility is. So they're not afraid. They're actually provoking, I would say. And then they have a special bus that comes when they need it and goes, so the bus will, small bus will come, they will pack in from that house that they live in or another house, and go to school, primary school, wherever they want to go. And they have a police presence as well. So you have armed police vehicles also cruising the streets, telling Palestinians to move their cars.
Yeah, I heard, I saw a video where they say the settlers, it's a very nice place to live. It's like a New Jersey suburb, and you have good schools, good supermarkets, and I think it's also highly incentivized by the government.
Yeah, so these are settlements in the West Bank. I wouldn't say that settlements, well, also depends. There are nice settlements in East Jerusalem as well, yeah. But especially in the West Bank, these are small towns with newly built buildings usually. Lots of water that people use, and it's cheap water, so they have swimming pools, they have gardens that they water all the time, while everywhere else the water, especially in summer, is a luxurious commodity. So they have better schools and better access to good education, better access to primary schools, better access to healthcare, and then there are incentives like lower taxes. Sometimes there are additional funds to help people move there. This is also part of when Israel is taking in larger amounts of new inhabitants, for example, from Ukraine. They would move them to settlements because they actually want to make a demographic difference.
Israelis taking inhabitants from Ukraine?
They did some, they took Ukrainians who were technically Israeli. And before that,
Jewish
Russians.
Ukrainians.
Yeah. Well, with Russians before that, it's not so certain how Jewish they were because not everyone had paperwork. But, white, possibly Jewish Ukrainians, Europeans, are always welcome. And then they're often proposed to move to settlements because, the government wants to have more people there. And it's also cheaper. And then, in general, you can divide the settlers into 2 groups. One is economic settlers, and the other is ideological settlers.
Okay.
So the economic will move to those places just because it's cheaper and better healthcare, better schools, everything you said before. And usually, especially the largest settlements in the West Bank are connected to Israel, especially to Jerusalem, with good highways. So it's a pretty quick commute. You can basically get to work from I don't know, one of the settlements in 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Of course, depends on traffic.
Okay.
So it's easy life. And yeah, it could look like suburbs in an American city. But there are also ideological settlers, and these guys are either claiming that they have to colonize the land for religious reasons or political reasons. But they tend to go to more remote settlements or start new settlements.
Okay. Like I have a lot of things to ask,
Yeah.
but let me ask, have you ever interacted with some settlers?
Yes.
Economic or ideological? Or something in between?
I would say ideological, masking himself as economic. Oh, yeah, another one. Yeah, okay. So, like, I had 2 longer conversations.
So what's going on in their mind? Because I'm a very optimistic person. I believe all humans have a little bit of empathy inside them, and for sure they are brainwashed. For sure, dehumanization helps, but aren't they? Don't they have this little bit of thought that they are doing something bad or inhumane?
So, in general, I think I'm an optimist, but in this case, is I think very hard to be an optimist about human nature. So the conversation number 1, let's say, more ideological person, but not very radical, would be a bit like talking to, I would say, white owner of a farm in the US during the still like slavery or just after slavery.
Okay.
Like, we treat them well. My gardener is Palestinian. They're my neighbors. It's all fine. But then if you would ask them, would they accept Palestinians to live in the settlement? It's no. They're a threat to us. They're different. They're others. They want us gone. They want to push us into the sea. And we have to take over the land to feel secure, but also because God promised us this land and it has to be ours. And we cannot share it. And then if you get an economic settler, they might have Palestinian friends. They might be even an anti-occupation activist. But they will tell you, yeah, but I have to live in this settlement because I got this apartment from my parents and I cannot afford to live elsewhere. But they don't see this whole issue of them empowering the system by living in a settlement on a stolen land that belongs to a concrete Palestinian families, because everyone knows who that land belongs to, like in the Palestinian community. Because also traditional indigenous land rights are very clear. So people know, but you might have an Israeli anti-occupation activist living there and they don't see the issue with that. They advocate for one thing, but in practice, they are part of this system of oppression.
Hypocrisy at its best.
Yeah, and they are really well-meaning also at the same time, which makes things complicated.
Yeah, I mean, humans are complicated.
Yeah.
And I understand if you're not optimistic, because I don't think if I never been there, but I don't think I can stay optimistic if I go there. It sounds crazy to me, like whole things. I mean, most of the things I knew, but still hearing it from you about the day-to-day things and people's mentalities, it's
And
sad.
we just started.
Yeah, we just started, exactly. What is PLO's role? Like, do they have some authority? Do they have some power? Do they do something that the government does? Like, they are government on paper, so do they have the sections of government like in normal countries?
Yes, that they have. The problem is real power, executive power, and the problem now is their cooperation with Israelis, and it has been a growing problem for years, but especially now, I think everyone can see that they tend to cooperate with Israel a bit too much. Like, there haven't been elections in Palestine since 2005. And then there was this whole division because Hamas won more seats in Gaza, and then they couldn't really get together to, build a bridge between two parties, Fatah and Hamas, and ended up splitting the power. There was cooperation. It's not like Gaza and the West Bank weren't talking to each other. They were cooperating, especially the ministries. And as I've seen it in a few years ago, it wasn't bad. But at the same time, it divided politically the whole Palestinian scene, which was, by the way, what Israel wanted and why also Benjamin Netanyahu, the now Prime Minister of Israel, who is, by the way, wanted by International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and war crimes. So he actually was involved in supporting Hamas financially. So Hamas would grow to be a second power, and there would be political division. So Fatah wouldn't be so much in power or the main character. But the PLO, so Fatah-based government in the West Bank, for years have been cooperated with Israel, especially when it comes to security matters, which means that security services of the Palestinians were working tightly with Israeli security. And especially now it's visible that, the government stays silent. They cannot really do anything. It's like Israel is taking over the land, is, dispossessing people, is shooting people. The Israeli settlers are entering Palestinian villages and towns, setting cars and houses on fire, killing people. They're protected by Israeli soldiers. And Palestinians cannot really do anything. Like, the most they did was, 7 years ago maybe, because Israeli soldiers in the middle of the night entered Ramallah, which is the seat of the Palestinian government. And they entered Area A, and they cannot enter Area A. So Palestinian security forces met them in the city on the street and stopped them and said, "Hi guys, we don't think you should enter farther." And then the IDF, the Israelis, turned back and they left and no shots were fired. And that's the most of the, two sides colliding.
Okay, so if you just say it in a scale, PLO is for namesake, kind of. Like, they don't have any real power. What about real life circumstances? Let's say I'm opening a shop in West Bank and I want to register my shop. Like, do I go to Israeli authorities or PLO?
No, you go to PLO in most of the cases. Also, if it's like a regular shop, so it's not a security threat on any level. And also, if you're not selling alcohol, because to sell alcohol, you would have to have a Christian co-owner. But that works, health ministry works pretty well, I would say.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, how is the health sector?
Yeah, you have private and public services. So public services are mostly under the Ministry of Health, and it works. It's not amazing, but Polish public sector is also not always amazing. But it works. But there's also a thriving private sector, health sector, and that is really good, I would say. But you have to have, it's a mix between a European kind of, Polish kind of example of security, social security, in which you have access to free healthcare in public hospitals. And then the American system of, if you have a good insurance, you actually get access to a very good hospitals. And also sometimes like private ambulances and stuff.
Okay.
And the ambulance service is covered by Palestinian Red Crescent Society, but they have their independent mandate, and they do cover the ambulances and like first responding services or responsibilities, which means that in Gaza they are targeted, of course, by Israelis.
Okay. So
And that's West Bank, because in Gaza there are no hospitals left intact anymore.
I'm aware.
Yeah.
And no doctors or like.
Yeah, they're being targeted, which is also, like another crazy thing also coming to this kind of regional dynamics of all of that being very nearby, is that from the West Bank, from the south of West Bank, around Al-Khalil, Hebron, from the roofs or hills, you can see Gaza. You can actually go to a rooftop of a building and see Gaza being bombed, because Gaza is like 35 kilometers away. It's not far. And in between, technically, you have this entity called Israel. The whole Oslo agreement was saying that there will be an exterritorial corridor that will link West Bank and Gaza, so they can actually be one entity, independent state in the future. Of course, they couldn't agree, should it be like a highway or a tunnel or something, but also that wouldn't fit the whole divide and conquer tactic, so it never happened. But it's really near. It's really like 30 kilometers. Like, I live 30 kilometers right now from the city center of Krakow. It takes me 35 to 60 minutes, depending on the traffic, to get there. Like, it's really not far. But it's a total different thing. Like, even now, West Bank is terrible. It's a lot of oppression, no right of movement. Settlements are growing. Settlers are very violent. The army is protecting them. There are arrests on a daily basis. And, like if Israel arrests people, they never know when they will be able to come out from imprisonment. And it's usually without any court orders or court dates or anything like that. It's called administrative detention. But in Gaza, it's a regular genocide. It's regular ethnic cleansing. It's war crimes. It's crimes against humanity. It's starvation. It's lack of healthcare, lack of water, not even mentioning education, having a normal roof over your head, having access to a shower. Like, these are luxuries now. And in between West Bank and Gaza, you have Palestine 48, thing called Israel now, in which, I understand people are so afraid in Israel of everything around them. But there's this kind of illusion that it doesn't really concern them, I think, in a way.
I think it's a sense of security.
I think there's in this whole insecurity in which there's this whole mentality of we can never be victims again, and we have to, attack them and take revenge and use this collective responsibility and fiercely respond to any attack from their side. So in this whole fear of not being secure, they do feel secure. They have the Iron Dome. They have other options. Basically everyone in Israel is a soldier in reserve. So they do believe in their country and their government in a very weird way, when it comes to this security.
Okay. Where do you see it going now? I didn't want to make it more political, but you can't avoid the politics to
Weird,
it.
it's all political.
It's all political. So where do you think it's going now? Do you think there will be peace ever?
So, funnily enough, I do believe in peace somewhere in the future. But it comes from some optimism that I have no clue where I carry in my heart. I honestly don't know why I'm still an optimist. And I believe in a few generations to come, there will be some kind of peaceful solution, although I think part of it is because we'll have other problems in the world. And it's just, it's not sustainable. This war, this constant war and constant oppression and constant colonization and constant occupation for 76 years is not sustainable. While we start to have bigger problems as humanity, like climate crisis. And actually waging war so close to home, what Israel does, or basically in areas that it wants to make home, it wants to colonize. Like, they're destroying the whole nature there. I don't really understand how they expect to live there in next years to come, after all this pollution of bombs and white phosphorus and everything else.
It's very less spoken about it. Also about feminism movements. Women are suffering in Gaza.
Yeah.
West Bank too, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's not being spoken about. Like, it's focused on children's rights and basically ethnic cleansing and the whole legal disputes about different words used. But it's also scary how I think disconnected we are from, like, human lived realities. And I understand wars were always in the world, but now it's being televised. We see it on social media.
Yeah.
It also affects us. Like, I cannot be, sorting my trash and putting plastic here and paper there and cans elsewhere and think I'm gonna, change the world and avert the crisis, the climate crisis, while there are so many bombs not so far away. It's like, like if I can go for holidays to Italy or Cyprus, and then Palestine is just right there. It's not so far as we might think, or as media would want us to believe, or history books. But also, so I come from Polish history when it comes to this optimism. Poland wasn't on the maps for 123 years. And it did come back. Like, I don't think people's identity can be erased so easily. I think it comes back. The problem is that usually as humanity we're so focused on having borders and owning land.
Yeah.
Like, the whole idea of ownership in a very European way of thinking about it. It's very European focus on nationalism, on national state, on national borders, that those borders have to be secure and you have to have ownership of that land, and that ownership has to be in the demographic majority which has to rule. These are ideas that were developed in Europe and then exported around the world, pretty often forcibly through colonization.
Yeah.
And you can see it very clearly in Israel and how they build their world around them, like how they construct their narratives. And I think this is not really, I hope this is not viable in the future if we want to function more or less normally in next generation. So in the end, I believe there has to be some kind of solution. I just hope that, that there will be no force in next diplomatic solution used and no manipulations. It will be more between people. But at the same time, what we see now with what is happening in the international law system, change of power in the US, from worse to even worse. I don't think I'm optimistic about next 10 years.
Next 10 years. It's a long time.
It's a long time, right? It's like, it feels like it's short.
The course of human civilization, it's nothing. But still, for the people who live there, it's a very, very long time.
And, imagine living under oppression or with disabilities. Like, it's the percentage of children in Gaza right now that will have permanent disabilities, not mentioning traumas, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, this is crazy. And this will be a whole next generation that will grow up there. Yeah. And we're not even sure where they will grow up because Gaza is inhabitable by now. and then Israel is already making moves to annex part of it. But it's not like, like history teaches us, it's not like those children and those people who will survive that will forget that they're Palestinians and forget that they had homes there, and they forget that their grandparents planted olive trees or had a house and had a home. Like, it's like if you're in Jerusalem and you see old houses, those old houses in East Jerusalem have Palestinian owners that know that these are their houses. They know whose grandfather built that. They know who lived there. They still remember, and they will remember, because intergenerational memory is a thing.
Especially when you're being oppressed day by day. So
Especially, yeah.
How was your psychology after visiting there multiple times? Did you go through something like Jerusalem syndrome?
No, fortunately, no. Jerusalem syndrome is a very religious thing that didn't affect me. But I did have a tiny bit of PTSD. A tiny bit, I would say. Of course, it's not comparable to anything that, Palestinians go through. But I've seen violence. I have been afraid. I guess now I should say that at least twice I should have been afraid for my life. I'm not sure if I was then, but maybe that's better, and adrenaline is better. And every time you go and you're never sure, but and then it's being worried about people.
You also, I think when we met, you told me about seeing guns everywhere.
Yes, when I came back, I think after first time, because first time I went this 2000 something was still in this trip in high school, but I didn't really understand much then. And then I went finishing my Middle Eastern studies, so I had this textbook knowledge, which is honestly nothing compared to seeing the reality and understanding it, or trying to understand it. I still don't understand it, but it took me years. And first I needed to deconstruct what I learned during my studies and from textbooks, because a lot of that was basically propaganda, or very simplified, or very European-centric. So I had to see on my own and try to understand what is actually happening on the ground where I am, what is happening to people around me. So it took me a while. But after this first stay there, when I came back and I saw guns, for example, with border guards at the airports, or some celebrations when you have this honor guards with guns, somewhere, in the city. For me, it was the university. They had this commemoration of Sonderaktion Krakow, which they're commemorating a day when the Nazis arrested professors from Jagiellonian University and took them to the camps. It is, I think, a bit ironic that triggered me, because I saw guards of soldiers with doing this honor shift, honor guards. It took me a while to go through that, but I did. And again, it was just, a moment I was there. And not I didn't even go there during the, the most conflicted periods of time.
Of course. And I heard even now it's... I heard about it in a podcast, as right now after October 7th is the most restricted time to travel inside West Bank.
Yes, definitely. Definitely the right of movement is hindered even more. It was actually a bit before that, which is also something I think we tend to forget, that there was actually a lot of happening in the summer of 2023. Some of the largest attacks of Israeli army on the cities in the north of West Bank were already in the summer. And it was already very violent, and it was obvious that it might get worse. Of course, people didn't expect what happened in October. But still, it was a bit worse already, and now definitely it's the worst that have been in ages. And it's not only day-to-day violence, but it's also that the colonization project is going forward faster. So people are being dispossessed and attacked, and settlements are growing. Like yesterday, I saw a video from fellow climbers, Palestinian fellow climbers, that the main and the nicest, I would say, cliff for climbing around Ramallah is now out of, like, it's not accessible because some settler put a tent on top of it and decided they will start a new settlement.
Oh my God.
And it's just dangerous. There's army there, like forbidding people to go there, protecting the settler, but to a certain extent, possibly even protecting people who would go there, because I would say settlers who start new settlements by putting tents and then some, like, again, how do you call, like, if you have on a transport, like when you transport, like, for example, for logistics on a ship, you transport things in this huge containers, cargo, yeah. So that's what they do. So they put cargo containers that, they can inhabit, or mobile homes or something, and they just decide that they will take this hilltop.
Okay.
Because of God's promise, usually.
It's a lot to intake, but I think the only thing we can do is hope that in the end humanity prevails, and somewhere along the way, because it's very hard to be optimistic about this certain conflict, over and over, it goes on before generations. So let's hope, along the way, people will find some humanity in each other and there will be peace. Thank you so much for doing this. For sure, we have to do it again. There's a lot to uncover from your experiences. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.